Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Warbirds in Review 09. I'm Dan Bolin. You don't know how much pleasure it is for me to say this. I'd like you to welcome back to Oshkosh my friend, Lieutenant General Gunther Rall. That's a real honor for me. To Gunther's left is a good friend also, Dr. Kurt Bratz, all the way from Germany. Kurt is a historian and a wonderful person who was our guide when we went to Germany 2 years ago. Kurt. And to my right is Wolfgang Geisel. He's the Chaya, excuse me. He is the test pilot on the new Me-262. German originally. He went through U.S. Air Force flight school here in the States. And it's a pleasure to have you here, Wolf. Well, where do you start with a guy who's done everything? Almost 40 years in the service of his country. Starting in 1936, I think you retired at 75, and I guess you just start off with, how does a young Christian Boy Scout who wanted to be a officer in the Wehrmacht, how do you become a fighter pilot? Three seconds.
First, I want to say many thanks to you that you come and are interested on all these stories we tell you now. Coming back to his question, 1936, I became a cadet in the infantry. I didn't have any touch to the Air Force, but when I was on the officer school in Dresden, a friend of mine, he was on the officer school for the pilots, and we met every Saturday. And he told me he was here chasing around in Germany over the clouds, and I was on the ground and said, "This is my new destination." And so I made an application to change to the Air Force, and as soon as I started flying, I knew I want to be a fighter pilot, and it became. I was a trained fighter pilot after the different courses, and right at the beginning of the World War II, I was transferred to the Wing 52, which was my home wing.
When you started off training, can you talk a little bit about the training, early training and flight training in Germany? I noticed that you flew a lot of different types of airplanes in your training process.
The total number of my aircraft I flew is 47. But we started in those days, 1938, with a Focke-Wulf 44, a biplane, and then Heinkel Cadet, Bigger Jungmann, Bigger Jungmeister, all biplanes. And the first aircraft with a cabin was a 109, and that's flew right at the beginning of the war. Before that, our fighter pilots training was still the old-fashioned three-ship formation and biplanes, Arado 68. And the 109, my really combat aircraft, I met the first time at my wing when the war started.
Kurt, if you would, talk a little bit about Germany back in the early 30s and the rise and fall of Hitler, of course, but he took over in 1933 as Chancellor. And what was the mood like in Germany at that time?
Well, yes, he took to power in 1933, and you must have in mind that inflation rate was very high. Germany had an incredibly high unemployment rate, which was owed to the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, and which put high loads on the German economy. It was almost impossible for Germany to recover from the consequences of World War I. So the unemployment rate was very high. we had more than, at a total, a population total of about 60 million people, there were more than 7 million unemployed, and there was no social insurance at all. So you can imagine that many families were really starving from hunger. And in a setting like that, in a framework like that, people tend to political extremes. And this was why Hitler took to power. In a way, the country was divided between communists and National Socialists. And finally, Hitler made the race and took to power in 1933. That was when Gunther was hardly 15 years old. And this is what makes me think, because he didn't have the chance to either vote for or against Hitler, but he was the one who had to fight Hitler's war, like many of his generation. You know.
We had dinner last night with General Rall, and he asked me, or I asked him actually, what would you like to talk about tomorrow? And he said, I have talked so much about shooting down airplanes and everything, I really would like to talk about something new. So we're going to talk about Germany after the war a little bit and some of the aircraft that he has flown. He really has an interest in doing that. But did you have a comment about Hitler? Yeah, do you have a comment about Hitler at this time?
No, first of all, I have to add to this. In the Republic of Weimar, Weimar Republic, right after World War I, and even in Hitler's Third Reich, an active officer was not allowed to be a member of a party. So they served their country or not a party. This was one thing. Coming to Hitler's, I mean Hitler's biggest mistake, which really split the nation and really makes us guilty, and we have to pay for that for the next 100,000 years. This is his racism and his horrible psychological, idiotical approach to the Jews. It was Hitler.
Well, one thing I have noticed, I've been lucky enough to interview pilots from the Soviet Union and Japan and Germany, and of course our own pilots, and they all have one thing in common, like you just said, Gunther. They didn't fight for any politician or any dictator or any emperor. They fought for their country. And that's a common denominator between fighter pilots. Wolf, what is it like for you as a German national to come over here and train under the U.S. Air Force?
Well, of course, it was terribly exciting for us. We had heard about the U.S., had seen the movies and kind of Hollywood style, and then to come over here, I was just 20 years old as an officer in the German Air Force. To come over here and train for a year and a half was absolutely exciting. And even though we enjoyed our time here, we couldn't wait to go home and tell all our friends of what we had seen and experienced in this country.
Kurt, let's talk a little bit about the effect of the air war on the German people. I know your mother and father had quite an ordeal, as did Wolf's parents. So could we talk a little bit about that?
Sure we can. The Allied bombing offensive started in 1943. That was when the 8th Air Force went into Britain and built up many airfields, and they joined forces with the Royal Air Force to bomb Germany. In a way, and to put it in simple terms, it was the task of the 8th Air Force to bomb military targets, whereas the British strategy was to bomb civilian targets and bomb cities in order to have an effect on the German morale, on the morale of the people as a whole, which turned out to be entirely wrong, because the people even went closer together and said, if we get bombed, we need to mobilize the last of our reserves to withstand all that. Just to give you an impression, the first real huge bombing raid on a German city was Hamburg, for a variety of reasons, because Hamburg was situated right on the North Sea coast, and the approach from southeast England to Hamburg wasn't that long. The British managed to blind out all of the German night fighter force by using chaff for the first time in history. There was not a real defense to that bombing raid. And in the end, more than 35,000 citizens of Hamburg had died, amongst them about 10,000 children. And that was the very beginning of the bomb war in Germany. And from then on, city to city had been picked out and tried to erase from the map, which failed in the end. But I remember my mother. She was 16 in 1943, and she went as a nurse into Berlin when Berlin was bombed, and that was quite an experience for her, which she's talking about over and over again to these days. She was a kid, you know, when she had to care for people who had been injured by phosphor bombs and things like that.
Wolf, did you have a similar experience? You were just 4 or 5 years old, right?
Yes, I was 4 years old when our house was destroyed, Christmas 1944, and even though I was very young, the memories are still very vivid because they were dramatic and traumatic. But the story has kind of a funny part of it too. In 1961, when I started going through U.S. Air Force pilot training, we had to go through language school at Lackland first, and then we're distributed among the air training command bases. And 5 of us wound up having to go to Selma, Alabama, to Craig Air Force Base. But we stopped overnight in Houston at Ellington Air Force Base, and this big Air Force Association convention going on. And of course, at night at the Oak Club, we stood out in our German uniforms, and everybody wanted to talk to us. Where are you coming from? What are you doing here? And I got into conversation with a retired colonel who flew in the 8th Air Force. And he said, "Where are you from, son?" I said, "I was born in the city on the Rhine between Bonn and Koblenz." He said, "What's the name?" I said, "Andernach." He said, "Spell that for me." And I did. And he said, "Well, I'll be a son of a bitch. I remember that, you know why? We were so pissed off we had to fly Christmas 1944, and that was one of our targets." And I grabbed him by the throat and I said, "You bastard! You dropped the bomb on my house."
Gunther, you told me last night that there was only, what, 10% of the fighter pilots of World War II that survived. Would you kind of give us a synopsis of your whole entire war? Where did you start out?
When the war started, I was on the Western Front with my Wing 52. And there was a great hesitation from our side and the French side to cross the border. The French flew patrouille on the other side of the Rhine River, and we on this side. Sometimes bigger planes came over, but very seldom. It started right after the change of the war, 39-40. From there on, we crossed the border, and from there on, and this is also in the first fight we had with the French Air Force. I got my first victory, and I tell this because it had some psychological effect. It gave me a self-confidence. You can do it, but when I shot him down, I got hit very seriously, and there's a warning for the next time you could be the one who goes down. From there on, I was more cautious. After the war, after the operation against France, we flew over England, and this was a serious enemy. Spitfire, Hurricanes, good planes, good leadership in the air, and we had losses, tremendous losses. We had also victories. After a while, we had to get out. We became new aircraft and new pilots, and went down to Romania because there was a first threat from the Russian side. Romania, Greece, great island, was horrible. From Greece back to Romania, and then the Russian war started. When we flew the first attacks against the Russian bomber fleets, they came without fighter escort, and their target was Constanza, it was an oil harbor. I stayed 3.5 years in Russia, and it was the lousiest time. You know, we were not prepared for the weather, for the winter, minus 30 degrees, for the snow. This was all new to us, even if from the staff from Hitler was announced when the first snow falls, the whole thing is over in Russia. The whole thing started in Russia then. After 3.5 years, I came back to Germany because Germany was heavily threatened by the 8th Air Force, by the 15th Air Force, and from there on I flew against the 8th Air Force primarily over Germany until the end of the war. We had, the relationship was, we always had, I give you one example. When I lost my thumb, it was 12 May 1944. Germany was attacked by 800 B-17 and B-24, covered and escorted by 1,000 fighter planes, Zemkis, Wolfpack, from the Harz Mountains down to Stuttgart. And we attacked this mass of airplanes with 75 aircraft, 50 Focke-Wulf into the bombers, and I as a top cover against the fighters. And this caused certainly in heavy losses. And at the end of the war, the fighter force, German fighter force, lost 90% of his fighters and 10% came home.
Unbelievable. Well, I want to tell you something, folks. In October of '07, I was lucky enough to be asked to go to Germany, and we accompanied a film crew over there, and they filmed Gunther at home, and Kurt was our escort, and we went all over Bavaria in the fall. And if you've never been to Germany in the fall, it's the most beautiful place I've ever been. The film crew is here today. Again, Scott Guyette right here with Sleeping Dog Productions over in Green Lake, Wisconsin. Scott, good to see you here, bud. Where's John? Is he here? Okay. But we filmed all over Germany and learned so much about the history of that beautiful country. And it was a pleasure to be with you, Kurt, and with you, Gunther.
In fact, you were so amazed that you got ticketed for speeding, right?
Well, Kurt's beautiful family joined us one night for dinner, and his kids were learning English, so they were practicing their English on us. And just a sideline. Gunther, would you please tell us a story about how you met your wife?
Yes. I was on the Eastern Front, and we had heavy fights, and we were stationed when we lived in tents between Taganrog and Rostock. This is in part of the Ostrov Sea, or the Ostrovsche Meer. We had a big dogfight, and I shot one Russian Lag-5 down, and in the flames I was blind, and at that time I was attacked by his wingman, and he shot my engine off, and so I went down. It was snow, and in front of me was a biker. What is it? A biker.
A Revine,
yeah. And I was just over that, stalling and crashing down, and the last thing I saw was the wall coming against me, then bang, and it was out of. I was, German tanks were in the neighborhood, and they came down and cut me out of the chunk of this airplane that was completely messed. And certainly I had tremendous pains in the back. I was scalped. This they could see. The soldiers from the army who took me back to Taganrog. And there was a burned out school, and under the ground, down there was a doctor, and he gave it the first medical help. But there was no X-ray, no nothing, and so I stayed a couple of while there, heavy pains, and then I was given down to Bucharest. There was a peacetime hospital with X-ray, and they X-rayed me, and the doctor came to me. He was an Austrian, and said, I was a first lieutenant. Forget this with flying. You never can fly. And I had a deep breath, and said, "Doctor, and I will fly." And the next train going to Germany, to Vienna, was a train, a Red Cross train, thousands of wounded soldier train, and we came after 1 week to Vienna. At night, with a small station, and the doctors came and saw what happened to me. And then I said, at that time, I had already, in Bucharest, how do you call it?
The cast?
Yeah, a cast. A cast, a horrible thing, you're very tight, and this way. And they discovered that I have broke my back 3 times. This was a fourth and fifth verbal, how do you call
Vertebrae.
it?
Vertebrae.
And the fifth here, and I was paralyzed, the right leg. At night in Vienna, I was taken to hospital, and the next morning, my station doctor came and checked what happened to me. And in the evening, I was called to the telephone. She said, "Leave him back, he cannot walk." And she took the telephone call, and it was my mother. She called that my father has died. And though the doctor came to my bed, the lady, Dr. Hertha Schön, came to my bed, and we talked almost the whole night. And this was my first contact with my wife, I was married for 43 years, and she passed away 25 years ago.
What he doesn't mention is that the impact of that crash into the ravine, he actually ran into an earthen dam, and it tore both wings off the aircraft, and the engine went another 50 or 100 yards away. It was a very violent crash, and he was very lucky to be alive. Actually, you got shot down, what, 8 times?
Yes, you get used to it. I got shot down. I was shot down 8 times. I was injured seriously 4 times. I bailed out once, and I had a mid-air collision with a Russian Lag-5 also once. And then I said, that's it. As he mentioned, when this was still open and the bone got out, I was not allowed to go to my combat unit, so I became commander of a fighter leader school. And there was a unit in the German Air Force was formed up by enemy aircraft which were restored, and we could fly them. They came to me, certainly I flew all of it. This was my interest. I flew the P-51, the 47, the 38, the Spitfire, and I could see the differences to our aircraft, to the 109 and the 190. And I don't now talk about all the differences, but only once was really impressed me. This was the P-51. A P-51, you know, we had in Russia tremendous temperatures, minus 30 degrees, and it was very hard to get an engine running at those temperatures because we didn't have any starting system. This was a system which was thrown up by the mechanic out of the right wing. And we made open fire. We never could get the engines running until we got a heating system to the 109. When I jumped in the 190, in the P-51, the first remarkable knowledge on the side was electrical starting system. That's it. Here we go. Then the cockpit. Compared with the 109. 109, a very, very narrow cockpit, no visibility to the back. The 51, beautiful cockpit, very good visibility. Then the undercarriage, very stable undercarriage in the 51. the 109 are very sensitive undercarriage, narrow and high. And we had a lot of pilots who made a ground loop and broke off the undercarriage. So then they had a very good formed wings, good weapons adjustment, no problem, flexible, speed, everything. But now the main difference, the endurance of the 51 was 7.5 hours, and the 109, 1.5. And these are all criteria, so they say are positive for the 51.
Well, you're the test pilot on the new 262. And how did you go about that? You know, he's test flying enemy airplanes with sometimes no manuals, and they have to put translation down there. That's pretty tough when you don't know the speeds and everything. But how did you run the test on the 262?
When it was clear that I was going to be the test pilot, which I volunteered for when the whole project started in Texas, I got a hold of just everything that I could get my hands on the 262, and of course, not just Günther, but I knew and I still know a lot of pilots who had flown the airplane in World War II. And so I interviewed practically everybody I could get a hold of. And they all assured me, don't worry about a thing. This is a wonderful airplane, very stable, no bad habits, but don't ask us any technical questions. Because the checkout, imagine that, I mean, we know through formal pilot training with academics and flights with instructors and flights at simulators, the checkout for some of these people was getting into the cockpit, being shown by a mechanic where all the switches were, how to close the canopy, here are the speeds, and then up by yourself into the traffic pattern, 1 landing, 2 landings. One of my friends had 2 traffic patterns and at night already up for the first mission. So I prepared for it by reading everything I could. The flight manual for the 262, the original flight manual, is maybe 5 pages, and it says hardly anything about the flying, more about ground handling. So I had to do it on my own and just get the airplane airborne and see what it was like.
How many airplanes do you have operational now? You have 2 or 3?
There are 2 flying. One is still being modified in California right now. I delivered it to Ione, where the Sanders brothers, who some of you might be familiar with, are doing some modifications to the specifications of the previous owner. And he just donated this airplane to the Collins Foundation. So eventually you will see this airplane in the circuit with the B-17 and the B-24. The other one is flying for the Messerschmitt Foundation in Manching in Germany. We are currently completing the number 3 flying airplane. We're waiting for engines to be delivered from Germany. And just a short comment on the engines. Of course, we're not flying with overhauled original UMOs, but with modern engines, the J85, which you're familiar with, our T-38 and A-37, or the civilian version of that General Electric engine, which is flying still in the older model Learjets. Much more reliable, have a lot more thrust, of course, too. So we are expecting these engines to come sometime during the summer, and within 3 months or so I will have number 3 airplane airborne. The number 4 is ready. It's a static airplane because originally most of the parts were made in Texas, and we had a lot of unairworthy parts that we built this static airplane, which is painted in the paint scheme of Lieutenant Ams, who is still alive, who was shot down by a Tuskegee airman in a P-51 with the bullet going through his oxygen mask. Now imagine how much is 1 inch at 500 miles an hour. And he bailed out. He's still alive, lives in southern Germany.
Let's talk a little bit about Adolf Hitler. I know you met him on 3 different occasions, and Kurt, I'd like you to also jump in here if you would. Adolf Hitler developed his psychosis over the war. Would you talk about the first time you met him, Gunther?
The first. The first time I was called to Hitler in November 1942. I got an order, this oak leaf, and from there on, Hitler personally delivered this, and so I had to report to him in his headquarters in East Prussia. That time, the German army was in front of Stalingrad, and there was optimistic sense that in 14 days we will have captured Stalingrad. So the Hitler gave us the order, and then we sat around his fireplace, and he developed his ideas. And they were very factual. Said what he has in mind to the Ukraine and all these the watering of the desert in the Ukraine and all things. This was substantial things, he said. Then we didn't talk very much, certainly not about party things. This was out. 9 months later, I had to report again. I got another order from Hitler, and this was quite different. We lost Stalingrad. They always corrected the front line. It means we went back. And from there on, I think the war was lost. And what Hitler now told us was, dark valley, silver horizon, but there's still some hope. There was no factual things anymore. The third time I was called to him in January 44. And the subject was certainly not anymore the Eastern Front, but he talked about when will the invasion come, where will the invasion come, how can we counter the invasion. This was the main subject of his speech. But this was a completely different Hitler. Hitler was, you could see his signature also, how it developed. The beginning of Hitler. And then the more pessimistic the whole thing became, his signature fell down. This was psychologically very interesting how the signature really showed the sense and the meaning and the situation of this man.
I should maybe add that there is a movie called The Downfall, I think, which you can also buy on DVD here in the United States, which is entirely based on eyewitness and ear witness, and deals with the last 2 weeks of Hitler's life in the Führer bunker in Berlin. This is very interesting if you want to have a psychological insight, if you want to get a hold of the man and want to know what it was like to be a subordinate to him, and if you want to feel the way he thought and the way he acted and how cynical he was, this is a really good movie. It is excellently produced. It is quite a lengthy movie. I think it's more than 2.5 hours. That's about what Forrest Gump is. But it's a really good movie, The Downfall. If you want to get hold of the man, have a look at this.
At this time, I'd like to introduce Connie Boland, who is the founder of this program, Warbirds in Review. Connie.
Not to take too much time away from Gunther, because he's certainly one of our most popular visitors here, I wanted to say a special thanks to Gunther and to Kurt for coming all the way from Germany, but take this opportunity to say thank you to all of our veterans and those of you, our veterans who are in the audience as well. Special thanks to our aircraft owners and to the volunteers who put this program on for you, including our moderators who do a great job. Ron Fagan, thank you for your beautiful P-38. We are sometimes victim to aircraft maintenance issues, so we tried very hard to get the ME-109. This is not a 109, Gunther, is it? Okay. This is a beautiful P-38.
I forgot it.
So a special thanks to the aircraft owners who always come forward to help me whenever I ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your hard work. She worked so hard putting these programs together, getting all these people over here and everything. It's just a lot of hard work. 2 years ago, she said, I'd like you to take over this program. And I said, ain't no way. I mean, I don't have the talent or the the computer skills to do that, but thank you, Connie. I guess we're going to talk a little bit about your favorite airplane. And a lot of people might be surprised what his favorite airplane. Would you tell us what your favorite airplane is?
Yes, there's only one favorite airplane, and I love it. It was a F-104 Starfighter. And unfortunately, we had too many accidents in Germany, not due to the aircraft, it was due to the men who served the aircraft, who flew the aircraft, who was not correct, but the 104 is for me. I was the project officer and was the first one who flew it. For me, the genius aircraft, developed by Kelly Johnson from Lockheed.
He was an aerodynamicist and a real genius. Invented the P-38, the F-104, the SR-71. What a guy he was. But what was the problem with the 104 that you guys encountered? How did you correct that problem?
We corrected, and then we stopped instrument flying, all these complicated things. We stopped it. We started flying from zero. And from there on, then I gave free when we go to night flying again on work again. Then we started and we cut down all the accidents. We come to a normal situation.
Well, I hate to break this short. I'm afraid we're going to get rained out here in just a moment. Would you have a final comment for us, General? Is there anything that you really want us to take away from this presentation this morning?
No, the one thing I say, I spent many times in the United States, and I got many friends in the United States among pilots, and particularly among fighter pilots, former fighter pilots. And I'm very grateful for this, that I could come again and think again.
It's so good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, thank you.
Kurt?
Yeah, well, do you think we'll have another 3 minutes?
Yeah, we could do that. I mean, when it starts raining hard, we'll just run for the tent. So go ahead, Kurt.
At this point, I would love to step in and tell you how I got to know Gunther. This is a story in itself. One day in 2001, I ran into the then commander-in-chief of the German Luftwaffe, and he asked me, "Hey, you're doing those pretty books on the history of the German Luftwaffe. Don't you think it would be a good idea to have Gunther Rall write his memory?" And I thought, oh gosh, you know, I was a kid of 14 when I started glider flying, and for my first pocket money, I bought a book that was written by an American author whose name was Edward Sims. This book was entitled Fighter Pilots. And Gunther, of course, was part of this book, and I really read this book in one day, and I thought, I'm never going to meet this man. So the then commander-in-chief asked me, could you do that? I said, oh, certainly I would. And he gave me Gunther's phone number. So I rang him up, and we had a date in his beautiful home in Bad Reichenhall. And I asked him, could you imagine writing your autobiography? And he said, no, I'll never do that. You can write about me whatever you like. I don't give a shit on it. But I'll never write my biography. And I said, you know, I'll never do anything in third person singular. Either we agree on doing something in first person singular, or we're not going to do it. Going to do it at all. And Gunther just answered, then we're not going to do it at all. So I went home, and I thought, how can I convince this man to do that? And then it dawned on me that it would be a good idea to compile a list of all the fighter pilot buddies of Gunther who had written their memoirs in first person singular. And what I had compiled in the end was a list that from A to Z that started with A like Bud Anderson and ended with Y like Chuck Yeager and Z like Herb Zemke. And then I went down to Bad Reichenhall again, dropped this list upon his kitchen table and said, do you think all these people are vain bullshitters? And he said, no, certainly not. This one goes to you, young man, and now we're going to give it a try. And this.
And here's the result right here. My logbook by Gunther Rall. He actually wrote this book. Kurt edited the book. And
I made blah, 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 and he wrote the book.
okay. But look at this. I mean, there he is on the cover. He was a dashing young fighter pilot. He hasn't changed much, by the way.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's for sale over in the tent there, and Gunther will be there to sign it in a few minutes. I want to plug this DVD that I'm glad to say I had a part in, but it's, in their own words, Warbirds in Review. It's also available at the tent. We're going to break up now. Thank you for coming, watching Warbirds in Review.